That's typical Dutch.
We wanted to be quick. We were all very stressed. We were more stressed than Michele.
Yeah. But in general, Michele is a calm type.
Yeah.
But you know, if you had a heavy lunch, it's difficult to stay awake.
Yeah, it's too sleepy.
It's not because you want to be rude or whatever, but it's that time of the day that you really need your energy to stay awake.
Yeah. No, so it was a good light.
Lush.
There was 3 people online this time. It's me and then 2 or 3 opponents. I will see you in person. And then you have René Beldenbos, Luc, and Michele Delera.
This kind of objects. Yeah. No, really. But he wanted, he was willing to talk because I worked on this kind of things. And he was interested in the fact that it was a depiction like of early trade exchange. So yeah, when we saw it together, I remember I said quite like this. The cover of my first book. But yeah, we're connected with this kind of it's crazy because it's really big. Like, this is almost actually the real size of the screen.
And it's painted or?
It's actually lacquer, so it's all carved and then filled with color. It's really beautiful. We saw it at TIFFUSION because this is from gallery that I know that deals in cross-cultural art from London. So we saw it.
All right, please. Please be seated. Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Michele Delera will defend the academic thesis Essays on Global Value Chains, Technology Diffusion and the Environment. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Pro-Rector, members of the Corona, friends and family, thank you so much for being here. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to provide a very short summary of my PhD project. Historically, trade has always been linked to the diffusion of ideas, technology, and new knowledge, from Neolithic times all the way to the Renaissance and to the modern era. With the modularity revolution, the ICT revolution, the emergence of GVCs have changed the organization of trade in a radical way. Trade is now a process that is globally fragmented and yet closely coordinated. The 4 papers of this thesis ask what the implications of this process are for the diffusion of technology. More specifically, I address 4 questions. The first one is, what are the institutional drivers of the global integration of emerging economies? Secondly, do GVCs accelerate the pace of technology diffusion worldwide? And finally, what are the implications of the organization of trade in global value chains for learning and productivity at different levels, and for environmental sustainability? The first chapter looks at the role of investment provisions in preferential trade agreements, PTAs, in fostering the integration of emerging economies in the global economy. There's a lot of talk around the role of trade agreements, and specifically deep trade agreements, so trade agreements that include provisions that regulate policies behind the border, so domestic regulations. And so far, this literature hasn't really looked at the role of investment provisions in trade agreements. The reason why I was interested in investment provisions is that, as you can see in this graph, foreign direct investment, so investment, correlates closely with two measures of GVC integration, value added in exports and the imports of customized inputs. In this paper, I focus specifically on customized inputs. These are products that are designed specifically to be used in specific production lines, and they commit buyers and suppliers to each other. This means they're considered very contractually intensive and very sensitive to the quality of domestic institutions. What I find is that deep trade agreements that do include legally enforceable provisions that regulate the protection of investment behind the border are linked to an increase in the flow of customized inputs from industrialized economies to developing economies by approximately 10%. And as you can see in the graph, the effect is particularly big about a year after a trade agreement gets into force. And it's interesting that one controls for the quality of institutions for the rule of law, this effect ceases to be significant, which suggests that these provisions act as a bridge in contexts where institutional quality may not be so high. The second chapter looks at knowledge spillovers in the context of global value chains. The literature on knowledge spillover is very large, takes us very different contexts, but underpinning all these various strands of literature, there are two questions. The first one is, how do you link the sources of knowledge to its recipients? And the second one is, how do you capture how much knowledge is being transmitted in a given relationship? In this paper, to address these two issues, I use an input-output decomposition to establish the link. And I focus on the amount of R&D that is embodied in different trading relationships, sourcing relationships. I distinguish R&D that is embodied in products that sectors source domestically from R&D that is sourced internationally in bilateral relationships, and also internationally in relationships that cross borders more than once. And I associated this last channel with global value chains. This graph shows the distribution of the R&D that is embodied in trade. The two things that are interesting is that GVC trade is actually quite a minor part of knowledge sourcing. Only in the car industry is sourcing in GVC more prevalent than other forms of sourcing. And secondly, it's not just the high-tech industries that source in GVCs, but sourcing is distributed across low and high-tech sectors. What I find is that indeed there are spillovers linked with trade in GVCs, and this effect tends to be larger than that associated with spillovers from domestic sourcing and from non-GVC international sourcing. Perhaps more interestingly, there is a degree of convergence. So spillovers tend to be somewhat larger for countries and sectors that are further away from the productivity frontier. Naturally, industries, countries, they don't source anything. Firms do, plants do. So the next part of the project deals with the micro level. The next chapter, chapter 3, uses survey data from 3 countries, Ghana, Vietnam, and Thailand, to study the extent to which participation in global value chains is linked with the adoption of new technology. And I focus in particular on technology that is considered Industry 4.0. So we're talking about automation, cloud computing, AI. What I find, as you can see in this graph, is that the adoption of digital production technologies that I just mentioned remains extremely limited. Over 80% of firms in a country like Ghana still use analogic technology rather than more advanced vintages of technology. However, participating in GVCs is linked to the adoption of these technologies. And we hypothesize that GVCs may essentially compensate for the weakness of domestic learning channels, such as universities and other channels that firms might rely on to learn in their domestic ecosystem. The fourth and final chapter takes us to India. In this chapter, we ask what the effect of importing and specifically of entry into importing is for Indian plants. The paper is in some sense an investigation of what is known as the technique effect of international trade. As you know, international trade is linked to increases in the scale of production, which tend to have a detrimental effect on the environment. It is also linked to shifts in the composition of industries, the effect of which is ambiguous on the environment. And finally, changes in the technology that is employed in production, which is typically associated with an improvement in environmental sustainability in countries that participate in trade. India is an interesting example to study this question. As you can see on the left, India started liberalizing trade fairly late, starting in the 1990s, but now trade accounts for a larger share relative to its GDP than China. And emissions in India are increasing rapidly as it joins the global economy. What is interesting in this paper is that we start by focusing on what plants produce on their product baskets. The reason why it's interesting to look at product baskets is because if you do not do that, you might end up misattributing differences in environmental performance, in energy efficiency, to plant level characteristics, when in fact this may be driven by the product basket, by the product mix. Because not all products require the same amount of energy. Some are more energy intensive than others. So what we do is we compute measures of energy intensity at different levels for plants and for individual products. And we end up with the final measure, which is there on the right, which essentially captures the difference between a plant's observed energy intensity and that which would be associated with the energy intensity linked to the products that it produces. So in some sense, it's a measure of how sloppy or how good a plant is at producing the products that it produces. The study builds on an event study. The setup is fairly simple to address selection and to make sure we're comparing the right plants together. We focus on plants that have already entered into import markets and that we know stay in import markets, with plants that we know will enter import markets in the future and will also stay as importers. What we find is that after entry into importing, plants learn. So they become more productive, the panel on the left, and they increase their sales, panel on the right. So there is a positive effect on business performance from entering import markets. At the same time, however, they become more energy intensive, again, relative to the types of product baskets that they have. The effect is temporary, as you can see. So it only lasts for the first 3 to 4 years, and then it tends to peter out. So in conclusion, the 4 papers sort of suggest that international openness is a conduit for technology diffusion and thereby for productivity growth. The GVCs can support learning, productivity growth, both at the level of countries and at the level of firms. The thesis is quite silent on the broader implications, the societal implications of some of these findings. So I think it's fair to say that this role that GVCs might play is fairly narrow. We do not know much about wages, for example. And finally, that there tends to be a trade-off between learning, productivity, and productive diversification and environmental performance, which suggests there might be an environmental cost associated with learning. There's a number of areas where I'd like to expand this research into. One is the use of the sort of augmented input-output models that I use in chapter 2. I think there's a lot of potential for this kind of work to study the effect of trade and consumption on nature dependencies, ecosystems, and biodiversity. It's an exciting area of research that is just starting now. A second, more concrete step, perhaps, is to extend the final chapter. And given that we're lucky enough not only to have data on what plants produce, but also to have data on what specifically plants import, to check how different typologies of imports might affect environmental performance. Capital versus intermediate products, for example, or perhaps more interestingly, trying to understand whether the sort of goods that are considered environmental goods, so linked to clean technology, whether the import of these goods is in any way linked with an improvement of environmental performance. Thank you so much for listening in. I think I now hand over the floor to the Prorector. Thank you again.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition now will be opened by Professor Dr. René Belderbos. He is chair of the Assessment Committee and Professor of International Corporate Strategy at UNU Merit, and also affiliated to the Catholic University of Leuven. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear candidate, my congratulations on the completion of the dissertation. I found it really well written and a pleasure to read. Well done in that sense. And I think there are also other things to like about the dissertation. I think each of the chapters, each of the papers has a contribution to make to the literature. Some of them have therefore already been published. I like the attention you give to the research design, methodology, and robustness. So it's carefully conducted research. I also appreciate the diversity in levels of analysis, country level, firm level, industry, country level, and also the different literatures that you draw on, not only trade and economics, also innovation management, for instance. So, in short,
thank you so much.
I liked the dissertation. Just one thing that I would mention up front that I found a little bit less worked out well, and that is the policy implications. So usually we see dissertations with quite a bit more than one page for the impact paragraph. You could have done a bit more there. But my question will not relate to that, maybe later if we have time. But my question relates to chapters 2 and 3, where you analyze the, let's say, the antecedents and the consequences of global value chain involvement by countries, especially emerging economies. As you note, specifically also in chapter 2, multinational firms play a key role in these global value chains. But they're invisible in your analysis. You don't pay attention to that. You don't have data. So, for instance, in chapter 2, you assume that if there are better investment provisions for foreign investors in a country, multinationals come in, they invest, and then they create these global value chains, and you get more global value chain intensive activities in the host country. But well, we don't know if this is the real mechanism because you have no data on investment specifically. So on page 52, you note that as an important limitation. What I find then quite important is that also this allows you to distinguish the two different types of global value chain involvement. One is the trade-based transactions, deep transactions between individual firms, and the other is the captive global value chains with multinationals trading intra-firm with their affiliates. I think that's an important topic. You give it some attention in chapter 2, but you can't really distinguish the two. So I would like to have a kind of thought experiment with you. So suppose that you do have data at the country and industry level on local affiliates and their activities in host countries. And you can augment your data on investment provisions, R&D, global value chain trade, with these data on multinational firms, local affiliates activities. My first question is, what would you expect to find in terms of the difference between the two types of global value chains, in terms of first antecedents, what are the drivers of the two different types of global value chain involvement, but also in terms of the consequences, maybe in terms of R&D spillovers. And if you want, there would be a more general question. If you have data on multinational firms, what are the more important research questions that you would like to answer that are left unanswered currently in the literature? So I hope you can share your thoughts on this with us. And So you can relate your ideas to either chapter 2, the research on chapter 2, or chapter 3.
So, highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for the kind words and for the questions. It's a very interesting question. And indeed, the role of MNCs as the coordinators of global value chains remains somewhat silent because of the data issue. I'm actually aware of at least one paper that tries to do this using Orbis data, but it's cross-sectional data for 3 countries. I think it's Germany, Japan, and France. So assuming that one would have more or better data, I think it's very difficult to say what one would expect ex ante, because all this literature on customized inputs, on contracting in global value chains is essentially empirical. There is this idea that you can somehow distinguish between relationships that are more manufacturing intensive and relationships that are more headquarter intensive. And if I'm now off the top of my head, I think the more manufacturing intensive would refer to more assembly type activities, whereas the headquarter intensive would focus more on sort of R&D, marketing, advertising, all the more upstream, more value added activities. So perhaps a way to try and start distinguishing possible effects on the drivers of investment provisions would be to, as a first step, try and distinguish between these more headquarter intensive and these manufacturing intensive relationships, to the extent that you can do it. Perhaps we're looking at sectors, perhaps looking at you might need a little bit more data on either the identities of these firms, what it is that they do, or on the products that they exchange and they produce. Maybe the lovely data sets on firm-to-firm linkages that, for instance, the Belgian central bank or the Costa Rican central bank host, perhaps that will be a source of information on these sort of on these things. So I would start there. I would start trying to distinguish headquarter versus manufacturing intensive and see what comes up empirically. I think the consequences, and I think that's the really interesting aspect. I think on the consequences, I will be a little bit less sanguine to the extent to which we might be able to find surprising findings. Most of the literature on, the effect of multinationals in host countries tend to be quite skeptical. So I'd be surprised, again, the effect might go back to that question that you were, or to the issue that we're raising, captive value chains versus more relational sort of value chains, the governance question. It's possible that there might be differences in the effects that we observe based on governance patterns and structures, which again are quite difficult to identify with empirical data. Again, one might start looking at the sector or other characteristics. But I will be a little bit more skeptical on the extent to which we might find positive findings when it comes to consequences. And I think when it comes to the drivers, perhaps the first step of trying to understand what is HQ intensive, what is manufacturing intensive, might lead us into interesting territory in terms of research.
Can I follow up a little bit? Yes. Okay, so I want to push you a bit more on the captive versus trade-based global value chains. So in your chapter 2, you find that investment provisions lead to greater GVC involvement. Yeah, that has to work through FDI by multinational firms.
Well, not necessarily, right?
Oh, okay, let's not get into that discussion. And that's an important way, right? Investment provisions lead to investment. If not, they're not good provisions, right? And in chapter 3, you find that global value chain involvement has a much larger impact in terms of R&D spillover than normal trade. So if I add it up, I would say you find together some kind of positive effects on productivity of FDI by multinational firms. But do you expect more spillovers in captive value chain relationship than in trade-based value chain relationship? Let me specify the question a bit.
Yeah. Again, it's a very interesting question. In principle, we tend, I mean, one would tend to think that captive value chains are, you know, the word speaks for itself, right? There is less scope for learning. Whereas in sort of more trade-based ones, you'd expect there'd be more scope for the recipient, so for the let's say the smaller firm in a developing economy to upgrade in different directions and explore what it is that they might be able to do. Whether this holds empirically, I'm not sure. I think many other factors come in. It might be what it is that these firms produce at the product level, the sector level. There may be captive value chains in highly knowledge-intensive industries that are more conducive, perhaps, to learning than more trade-based ones. And I think maybe one important element is that probably, again, going back to the question of, or to the issue of customized inputs, probably all of these different types of value chains, they still have a relational element, whether they're captive or more trade-based. There's still a degree of commitment between the two parties that, in principle, should allow for a degree of diffusion of knowledge, regardless of whether it is captive or not. So I appreciate that I'm not really answering the question, but I think it might depend.
Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Meli Siani. She is also a member of the assessment committee, and she's professor of applied economics at Lewis University, and she's with us online. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to read this thesis that I really enjoyed. I also congratulate with Michele for the accurate work, the different streams of literature that have been covered, so the very rich bibliography, and the kind of data that have been used, and the robustness of the methodology. So I really enjoyed reading the thesis. I will focus a little bit on the third chapter to raise my questions, and in particular on the impact of spillovers coming from participation in global value chains. And first of all, I think you find two interesting results that, in my view, maybe should be discussed a little bit more in the light of the literature, also in terms of probably policy implications. And I think they're also very relevant for the new trends in the fragmentation process that might be forthcoming in the following years. So the first result is the fact that you find much larger spillovers linked to participation in global value chains with respect to those linked to other forms of internationalization, for example, imports. And so I would like a little bit to spend some words on the interpretation and policy implication of this result. And the second one, I think that's even more interesting, is the negative moderating impact of R&D expenditure on the relationship between GVC-related spillovers and productivity growth. This basically means that countries that are behind in terms of R&D expenditure, they tend to benefit more. They tend to benefit more from spillovers with respect to countries that spend more in R&D. And this is somehow a little bit of a counterintuitive result if you think about all the literature on the role of absorptive capacity, and therefore the importance of having a certain level of R&D expenditure in order to be able to benefit from international spillovers. So I would like to ask you how to interpret these results, whether it is whether it is linked to a simple, let's say, problem of convergence. In this case, maybe R&D would not be the best indicator to capture this, but it could be more effect of countries with different starting points and therefore different possibility to benefit just because they are different in terms of the level of initial productivity. And again, I think this is a very important result because it somehow gives an optimistic view of the benefit of inserting into global value chain for developing and emerging countries. And so I would like also to speculate a little bit on the debate nowadays that is a little bit more on the risks of being involved in global value chains in terms of, for example, economic security. So it's quite interesting that your work is still reads international trade as a source of spillover, while there are some more recent works where basically trading with partners with a high level of R&D expenditure might be considered a threat rather than an opportunity in terms of, let's say, stealing ideas and losing the manufacturing basis, for example, for advanced countries. This is beyond the scope of your doctoral thesis, but I think something can be said a little bit in terms of policy implications. Thank you very much, and congratulations again for your very interesting work.
So highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much again for the kind words and for the very interesting questions. So let me address the two questions one by one. I think the first finding when it comes to the fact that these spillovers might be bigger when they arise from GVC relationships, I think the result might be driven by the relational nature of value chains, which is an issue that started being, it's been studied for a very long time, of course, but it started being studied in a quantitative way only recently. Again, studying it properly requires perhaps firm-to-firm data again, or other more rich sources of data. But again, when it comes to speculation, I think a lot of pieces of evidence from distinct sources point us to the fact that the relationships between firms, between buyers, suppliers, affiliates in GVCs are closer than they are in normal bilateral trade. There is commitment. The products are designed specifically to be used in a certain way in a certain production chain, right? Batteries nowadays are produced to be fit in a certain electric vehicle, for example. So this sort of design, this sort of element of product design by customization, I think, is what perhaps ultimately leads us to find this result. And going to the second question, which again is extremely interesting. I'm personally not. I agree that it is somewhat counterintuitive, and I think there is something to be said about the fact that using just R&D as a proxy for absorptive capacities might not be enough. So I think an interesting question is whether we can look at different ways to proxy for that. But if we take it as a good proxy, which I think remains an open question, I think what we are observing here is perhaps goes back to the whole debate on the advantages of backwardness. And perhaps an important point is that the data set for chapter 2 is wide, right? Which only includes economies that are already fairly developed. So when we're talking about countries that sit far away from the productivity frontier, we're talking of countries like Poland or Slovakia, to some extent China, of course. And I think all these countries are actually good examples of the benefits of global integration. Poland is an economy that has gone from, I don't want to say poverty necessarily, but from a low level of industrialization and development prior to its integration in the EU, and which is nowadays a massive success story economically. Partly thanks to its integration in GVCs and as a supplier for German manufacturers in the car industry, for instance. Slovakia is a similar example. Hungary is a similar example. And I think these findings hold in the new geopolitical framework in which we live. I do think that the risks are real. I think COVID-19 has showed us all what it means to be overconnected to some extent, right? And how shocks propagate quickly. At the same time, it was also an example of the resilience of our production systems, because we managed to get production back in line relatively quickly, given the terrible things that were happening. But at the same time, I do acknowledge that threats when it comes to unfair competition, the new emphasis on open strategic autonomy. I think there is value in these ideas. I am just somewhat concerned that we lose track of what is good about international trade, and that I do think that a lot of countries, a lot of firms over the past 20 years or so actually did benefit, even though, yes, sometimes ideas were stolen. So that would be my take on the second issue.
Thank you. Yes, just a very short, let's say, clarification on again my second point, in the sense that I agree with you that it could be the effect of a sample of countries where those that lie too much behind in terms of technological capabilities are not covered. But still, I think there is maybe something about the conditions that allow this possibility to benefit from the participation in global value chains that are a little bit, let's say, not completely emerging from your, let's say, regression results, as you were probably also saying, in the sense that this idea of a certain level of either, let's say, increase in R&D expenditure or investment in human capital accompanying the joining of the global value chain, that is a little bit out of the picture of your regressions that might maybe deserve some either inclusion or discussion.
Thank you for that. And sorry, I realized that I completely missed this element in my answer. I do agree. There's a number of, I think, more simple, more complex policy actions and institutional factors and different sets of investment that all these countries that, as I said, benefited from the global integration have put into place, some fair, some less fair, let's say. So I wouldn't want this chapter to suggest in any way that global integration is in and by itself conducive to knowledge diffusion without countries or firms having to do anything. I think you're right, and this element could come out clearer from this chapter. The role of all the different policies at the micro, meso, and macro level that these countries have had to experiment with and implement in order for these benefits to actually materialize.
Thank you very much for the discussion and the thesis.
The opposition now will be continued by Dr. Goedhuis. She's a member of the Assessment Committee and researcher and PhD Program Director at UNU Merit.
Dear candidate Michele, I would also like to congratulate you with your thesis for all the reasons that have already been mentioned before. You use many different literatures, many methods, you analyze things on different levels of analysis. But it's I also found it extremely well written. So it was absolutely a pleasure to read this thesis on a topic that is really at heart. So very well done. When I read your thesis back in November, I believe it's already a while ago, I remember that at the end of your introduction, you wrote something that was lingering in my head. So you really are explicit about the fact that your thesis was written still from an optimistic tradition on the benefits of international trade, I believe, where then usually it stresses technology diffusion, productivity growth that it can bring. Of course, we now know that the world has changed. We woke up in a different world where we see much more protectionism that is the result of geopolitical tensions. But also within countries, we notice that there are divides in our countries that people do not, that are even threatening our democratic systems. Many of those could be traced back to people having a feeling that they are not benefiting from globalization as they should have, or that it's not taking their social concerns into consideration. We also observe climate change effects more frequently. So what I am wondering is a general thing. Do we as economists, have we underestimated all the negative consequences of international trade, consequences that relate to environmental effects, but also social effects? And so that is a general question. Related to that, knowing in the current situation, would you change the focus of your analysis in the chapters that you actually deal with in your thesis? Would you make any changes to that? Are there things that should be more emphasized in the thesis? So yeah, that's actually what I would like you to reflect about. Thank you.
So highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your kind words and for these very interesting questions. Yes, as I was writing the introduction back in November, and it had been some time since I wrote the last chapter, I realized how out of tune, to some extent, the thesis read with some of the changes that we observe around us. And I do think that collectively, perhaps there was an underestimation of the social impacts of international trade. I mean, this has been driving, to some extent, politics for now a few years. Specifically in the US, I'm not sure to what extent in Europe. I think we're waking up to that reality now, with the discussion on import competition on clean technologies, for instance. I think the US was ahead of the curve in that point of view. I'm thinking of that book, Janesville, I think, which talks about what happens in a former manufacturing town that was producing for Ford, and then everything gets shipped to China, and the sort of hollowing out of that community. So I do think that there is definitely some truth to the underestimation issue. Of course, whilst we did underestimate, I think the general public has always also underestimated the benefits of trade, and I always go back to that simple observation on collective action. You know, the fact that benefits from trade tend to be distributed fairly widely. We don't necessarily notice that a carton of milk is 10 cents cheaper, but that its costs are felt by specific communities, for example, right? So there is a bit of both, in my opinion. Whether I would have changed the focus, yeah, definitely, I think. And I think to some extent I did, because I started, so the last chapter was written a little bit later into the process. I had done some work on GVCs and the environment prior to writing that chapter, and I don't think economists have underestimated necessarily climate change. I think maybe I personally, in my work, I had underestimated it to some extent, but I definitely moved closer to that topic because of this feeling of having missed a few things in the process. So I think today I would have a greater interest in issues of not just climate change, but generally on environment. There is so much work that can be done on issues, as I mentioned, of nature, ecosystems, biodiversity. We are still very, I think, a little bit in the dark when it comes to the impacts of consumption in the global north, of trade, on some of these elements. But we know a lot, but not as much as on other issues, for example, and it's a very pressing one, I think. I think, you know, what I was hinting at when I was presenting the conclusions, I also think there's a number of social elements that are outside of the scope of this thesis that I would love to be able to look into. Working conditions, wages. There's a lot of great work done by anthropologists on what happens below the first tier of suppliers to global value chains. The third, the fourth, even the fourth tier, conditions tend to deteriorate dramatically, for example. And it's very difficult for us as economists, to look at that because we don't really have data. It's really below the radar. And one would hope that over time, these, you know, all ships, the situation gets better for everyone, but I think there is a lot of work to be done on that front as well.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Jaaks. He's also a member of the Assessment Committee and a trade policy analyst in the Trade and Services Division of the OECD. And he is with us online.
Thank you. Let me first of all join the other opponents in congratulating Michele on this great achievement. It's really an impressive piece of work that I've thoroughly enjoyed reading. As already mentioned, it covers a broad range of issues, and it's impressive how the author covers very diverse contexts, but also methods, just to give examples, ranging from recent input-output methods to recent stacked difference in difference methodologies. So congratulations on this impressive piece of work. My question now relates to a point that has partly been addressed already, and this is sort of the question of how your work relates to the current context and how the overall debate on trade and investment has evolved in recent years. And I think in several cases in your thesis, you use data that looks somewhat outdated by now. And this sounds maybe harsher than I intended to be, because obviously at a given point in time, you only have access to data that have some limits in terms of coverage. But I'm thinking, for example, of chapter 2. So that's the first empirical chapter where, first of all, I wasn't quite sure if your endpoint was 2015 or 2018. There were diverging statements, I think, on 2 pages. But more generally, I was wondering if there are some implications in the sense that you have a period that covers 1995 to roughly 2015 to 2018, and your focus is on investment provisions, which I gather are somewhat more typical of deeper trade agreements. And this reminded me of analysis we have done with colleagues where we looked at deep services trade agreements, and we found that and this is very much in line with what you found, they take some time to actually translate into effects. And B, the really profound and deep ones are not really abundant in the early years. And this led us to look at whether it was just a limited set of agreements that actually drove our results. So this would be my first question, whether you have done any checks as to whether some of the more intriguing findings would possibly be explained by a small set of agreements. And secondly, whether you had any thoughts as to how recent developments beyond 2015-18 in terms of corporate due diligence legislation, but also new generation trade agreements that have been concluded since the end of your period of analysis would potentially be of relevance to the channels that might be underlying the results you're discussing in your chapter.
So highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for your kind words and for your questions. May I ask, sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Were you referring to work on deep services trade agreements or to deep trade agreements in general?
On my side, that was sort of my personal association, but I understand you did not look at deep services agreements. My question was more whether you have looked at how ubiquitous or common the agreements were that sort of drove the variation in your data, whether potentially some of your results might be explained by just a few important agreements.
No, thanks for that. To answer, so the data does go up to 2018, and it would be very nice to be able to, I think the data should probably already be out there to try and extend it to 2022 or at least 2021. I do have the feeling that they might be driven by a small set of agreements. I think most of the work on trade agreements point to relatively small gains. And to some extent is also what I find, right, across the board. What is interesting about the results is that you find a fairly clear-cut impact on a very specific subset of relationships, right? So these are relationships where the exporter is based in the global north, the importer is based in global south, and they're trading customized products. Now, this may be driven by investment or by outsourcing. We don't really know based on the data. But this is just to say that I think my work also points to the fact that, generally speaking, even deeper trade agreements do not necessarily seem to have that large of an impact on trade in general, let's say. Having said that, I did not actually run a check on what is driving the results in terms of whether it's a subset of agreements, and I think that's a very interesting point. I'm not sure what to expect, again, given that the subset that I am focusing on is fairly specific in a way. So I'm not sure ex ante whether to expect that indeed it's a very small set of agreements that are driving these results or that they're distributed across agreements. I think my gut feeling would be similar to yours, so I would expect that perhaps it's a smaller set of agreements that are driving the results, but it's a gut feeling, right? I don't have a strong, just based on prior work, I don't have a strong sense, evidence-based sense of this question. But I think it's something that would definitely be important to look into moving forward with this chapter. And when it comes to the new developments, I think everybody you talk to, exporters, industry associations, a lot of people are complaining a lot about the due diligence regulation. I personally think but again, it's a personal opinion, I personally think it's a very good development, but whether it's positive for trade flows and for the specific trade flows that I'm looking into this chapter, I'm not so sure. Just based on this uncertainty and resistance that there seems to be out there in terms of how many barriers to trade this sort of regulations might unleash. And when it comes to the sort of new generation trade agreements, I think, again, I haven't seen a lot of debate around new generation trade agreements when it comes to investment. But there's a number of new generation agreements concerning digital trade, for example, services trade, that I think would be potentially very relevant for again, more broadly for the global integration of at least that subset of emerging economies that is advanced enough to be able to integrate in global value chains in a meaningful way.
Okay, thank you very much for this response, Michele. Just very briefly, and I'm aware we might not have that much time left. Part of the motivation for my question about a potential subset of agreements driving the results was this very interesting but also somewhat fascinating or confusing finding that you discussed, that once you control for institutional quality, it seems that the investment provisions are no longer clearly significant as a predictor of north-south investment flows. And for the south-north flows, you even observe that the effect is now negative. Without going into too much detail, I was wondering if you could briefly revisit this finding and give us an intuitive understanding of potential underlying channels explaining this result, the negative effect once you control for institutional quality.
So just to clarify, we're now talking about the fact that once you control for institutional quality, south-north trade becomes negative, right, in the estimation?
Yes, the coefficient of the provision variable, yes.
I think I would need to think a bit about this. What might be driving this specific result, because it's been a while.
Maybe move to the next question.
Yes, since we have one more opponent, my suggestion would be to think this over and to discuss this afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah, with Dr. Jacks, okay? Okay, thank you. Now the opposition will be by Professor Luc Soete. He's Professor of International Economic Relations at UNU Merit at Maastricht University and former Director of UNU Merit and former Rector Magnificus of this university.
Thank you very much, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, dear Michele, I read your thesis country to Dr. Goodhuis very recently, actually yesterday, and so it is still very much in my mind. And as I'm formerly Professor of International Economic Relations, of course it gives you clearly the impression that I am in a crisis field in my own discipline, or in my own sub-discipline. And what I find always remarkable is that the most heavy critique comes not from the economists, the international economists, but it comes from the people in international economic relations, which are more the guys working on international relations. And I just give you this quote from David Singur. He describes the world without walls of the international economist as a world historical gamble. assigning a market-led order pride of place in setting the terms of international relations, whereby states, including large firms, are supposed to defer and enforce the private cross-border orderings of the global market, which mainly means letting a transnational price system determine where production goes globally and thus who gets what in globalization. And as Professor Miliziani and actually Dr. Goodhuis referred to, I would like to ask one of your paronyms to read out, you can choose which one, to read out page 26, paragraph 2 and paragraph 3.
Page 26.
Page 26, the second and the third paragraph, please.
The discussion on international trade has changed in a more subtle way and driven less by charitable concerns. As I write this introduction, the long shadow of COVID-19 and geopolitical tensions continue sending ripple effects through the world trading system. Industrialized economies are reaching for technological sovereignty in all but name, and large firms are considering vertical integration and near or friendshoring. For all of one's misgivings, the success stories of the last 2 decades, I am thinking of China, Poland, and Vietnam, among others, are inextricably linked to a mix of conscious policy intervention and GVC integration. All social science is an exercise in looking at the past, economics being the only discipline, together perhaps with history, with the ambition to sit at the intersection between past and future. In the case of GVCs and international trade, more generally, the future may not look so similar to the past, and it may not look so bright either.
Thank you. Well, let me then ask you some questions specifically with respect to this uncertain intersection between past and future. When I read in the past articles and contributions on global value chains in the old days, these were always defined or often defined in terms of joint ventures, multinational enterprises, my colleague just mentioned these also, global supply chains with a strong focus on the problem of transfer pricing. I refer to Konstantin Weitz or Sanjay Lal. Actually, the first director of UNU Intec was specialized in the area of transfer pricing with respect to global supply chains. You focus on technology diffusion, which I very much welcome. But my core question then is, why cannot, referring to your chapter 5 or your chapter 4 with section 5, why cannot environmental concerns become fully part of knowledge diffusion? I'm sitting here next to my pro-rector, and if I take the example of ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria, and the recent Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive of the European Commission, whereby major corporations and multinational organizations already have to demand their suppliers to meet specific ESG criteria, including environmental standards, ethical labor practices, and transparent policies, this operational technology, this organizational technology should spread internationally, and quite certainly if it is then linked to CBAM and to various other elements within global value chains. So why can't you be optimistic with respect precisely to the environmental, organizational, institutional aspects?
I think there's highly esteemed opponents. Thanks for the kind word and for the question. I do think there's many reasons to be optimistic about the relationships between GVCs and environmental sustainability. Part of this is driven by regulation, as you're saying. And part of this is just driven by, to some extent, technology. As firms become greener and as firms continue investing in foreign countries, part of the greener technology should come with them, with potentially positive impacts on the environment in these countries. The problem is, I think, that in many of these countries, the grid remains extremely, the electricity that is used remains powered by coal, by fossil fuels, and that's something that GVCs can't really change, that the global economy cannot really change. It's something for global policy cooperation, for domestic governments to to actually take care of that.
Please continue your answer.
Thanks. So I think there is reason for optimism. There's also reason for a bit of skepticism, because the world is moving fast, and for developing economies to be able to decarbonize quickly, ESG is probably not enough. There are massive investments that are needed and massive support that is needed from the global north to be able to actually decarbonize, and it's hard stuff that is needed. It's clean tech, and regulation and global integration are only a small part of that equation, I think. Again, personal opinion, but yeah.
Mr. Delera, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request you and your company to await the results of our deliberations and our return in this very room.
Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. Better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't wait. waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Please be seated.
Mr. Delera, the Degree Committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the Degree Committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Pietrobelli is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to take the floor now.
All right, please.
Is it on? Okay. Michele, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Michele Delera, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here today and celebrate the graduation of Michele Delera. During these years, I've learned to appreciate his intellectual and professional skills, as well as his warm and friendly touch that have made this journey very pleasant and enriching for me as his supervisor. Congratulations, Michele, congratulazioni, and my most sincere wishes to achieve your future professional and personal targets. I met Michele long before you. Long time ago, a friend called from UNIDO, the UN Industrial Development Organization, and introduced this bright Italian fellow, willing to continue and deepen his education. We agreed to meet. Michele came to my office in Rome. He told me of his interests and aspirations, of his London background, and already made a strong impression. I told him stories about global value chains and Latin America and innovation and learning and the work that another student of mine, Caio Torres, that we all know, was doing. And Michele showed so much interest that he decided to apply to UNU Merit and undertake his postgraduate studies in Maastricht. Looking at his route with hindsight, I'm surprised to discover how much he followed the path of his older Brazilian fellow. He studied GVC and technology. He published in remarkable scientific journals before even finishing his thesis. He got married. He moved to the north for a job. And he even ended up working for the same company. Striking similarities, though, with different passports. And during Michele's research towards his PhD, I could appreciate his intellectual clarity, his sharpness in drawing effective synthesis in a literature that has been expanding in multiple directions and spanning across several related subfields. His London Cockney background also helped, and I'm sure will prove to be an asset for his career. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, Michele was invited to present his work at the Italian Industrial Economists Association in Venice. He gave a speech presenting new results on technology adoption in developing countries' firms, and as he spoke, nobody believed he was really Italian. His accent and looks and manners made him the perfect young and bright student from a London university. And among his many qualities, I would like to single out that he was a reassuring and supporting reference for his friends. He shared an office with Maisha and Uri, there they are, and during the daunting first year of the PhD, he was constantly the calm one. A grounding presence, as someone suggested, in spite of his unstopping and loud typing. He was typing all the time. And we saw it, we saw the results. Even after he left Maastricht, he has always been the most reliable friend to his friends and colleagues. In these years, I could also enjoy and value his rich intellectual curiosity. Although his thesis revolves around the topics of GVCs and their implications for the international diffusion of technology, he managed to address different specific angles, from trade agreements to Industry 4.0 to energy and environment. In addition, together with Uri, he managed to set up a reading group in the Institute that functioned quite well for some time and covered several interesting topics. I could also appreciate Michele's incredible capacity to work autonomously and independently. Sometimes he disappeared, other times I disappeared, and he inevitably turned up with a new idea, with a newly organized database, with a new original research question. He went through the COVID-19 years with admirable continuity and determination. And his stubborn determination was confirmed by his tireless effort to catch up with all the readings for his PhD courses and research. He used to print all the papers and research materials and build an impressive stack of papers on his desk. We suspect he never read all of them, but he nevertheless left them there throughout, always there as a sort of a threatening presence.
You're there.
His closest friends could never figure out whether this was because he still ignored the use of digital devices to store, read, underline, analyze knowledge, or if such stack of paper serves as a badge of his erudition. I tend to think it was the latter. Michele managed to survive the PhD experience in extraordinary years with remarkable stability, determination, optimism, and he did it brilliantly. I'm sure he will continue like this, and let me congratulate him again for his PhD thesis and wish him success and happiness in all his endeavors. Complimenti, Michele.
Grazie mille.
Thank you for the laudatio. Before closing this academic session, I would also like to give floor to the Corona members abroad to congratulate you, because I know once we have left this room, there's little opportunity to do so. So let me turn to our guests abroad and give them the opportunity to congratulate you as well. There's another order. Professor Meliciani, maybe you would like to start?
I'll begin. Congratulations, Michele. A great job in the defense and with the thesis. And I see it's a double celebration today, I think, no, with you and Uri defending. So have a good evening. When we're finished here, I'll celebrate by going to bed.
Thank you, miss you.
Thank you. Dr. Jaaks, would you like to add something to this and to congratulate as well?
I'd first of all like to thank everyone for the opportunity to participate today, and I would like to really encourage Michele to thoroughly enjoy this experience. It's all the reason to be extremely proud of an impressive achievement.
Thank you so much.
Professor Meliciani?
Yeah, I would really like to congratulate with Michele for this brilliant discussion of today, and also I was impressed by the interest of Michele in the way in which he was also answering the questions during the discussion of the thesis, and the fact that now he has moved to work in the private sector also is a sign of let's say, the fact that he enjoys the theory, the conceptual work, but also to see what is really happening in the world. And so I wish you all the best with this experience coming after the PhD. Congratulations, Michele.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us, the audience. Thank you to the members of the Corona. Congratulations to both the supervisor and, of course, Dr. Delera, and also on behalf of the university and the executive board of the university, congratulations. And now I will close this session, and I think now there is time for something to drink. Yes, we'll make some pictures. First of all here. En ik denk zonder de trap ook, denk ik ook. Ja.